The year was 1148, and the banners of the Second Crusade fluttered above the battered walls of Antioch. The Christian armies had crossed deserts, marched through blood-soaked fields, and endured hunger and plague. Yet the clash of steel was not what Europe carried home in its gossip. It was the name of a queen. Eleanor of Aquitaine, consort of Louis VII of France, had followed her husband across half the known world. She was young, dazzling, and richer in her own right than most crowned rulers. Louis prayed like a monk and moved through war like a reluctant pilgrim. But Eleanor lit the courts of Outremer with a brilliance that silenced even the weary nights. Her laughter filled the halls of Antioch. Her presence drew every eye, and her will unsettled kings. Then came the whispers that she no longer shared her husband's bed, but the chambers of another, that the Queen of France lay in the arms of Raymond of Poitiers, the Prince of Antioch, who was also her uncle. Around the fires, soldiers muttered that while the king fasted, the queen feasted; while the king prayed, the queen sinned. Chroniclers seized the rumor like sharpened blades, eager to carve her into scandal. The tale was poison. It crossed mountains and seas faster than any crusading army, back to Paris, back to Rome. A queen accused of incest, a marriage shaken by humiliation, a dynasty shamed before Christendom. From that moment, Eleanor of Aquitaine was no longer just a consort. She became the most dangerous woman of her age, the figure who would stain two crowns with scandal. How did she dare to defy a king of France, wed his rival in England, and survive 16 years of captivity? Was she a sinner who destroyed thrones, or a legend who bent them to her will? Stay with us until the end, as we uncover the truth of Eleanor of Aquitaine. And if you crave more tales of rulers undone by scandal, betrayal, and blood, remember to subscribe so you will never miss the dark secrets that history tried to bury. Long before Antioch, before whispers of incest and rebellion, Eleanor of Aquitaine had already carried the seeds of scandal within her. She was born in 1122, heir to the Duchy of Aquitaine, one of the richest and most coveted lands in Europe. At 15, she inherited not just fields and castles, but a court alive with poets, knights, and the intoxicating idea that power could rest in a woman's hands. Where most princesses were pawns, Eleanor was a queen waiting to be crowned. Her father's death left her both vulnerable and irresistible. Suitors circled like hawks, and the King of France himself acted quickly. Louis VI arranged for his son, the pious Louis VII, to marry the dazzling young duchess. In 1137, Eleanor rode north to Paris as the bride of the future king. The union gave France wealth, prestige, and territory. But what it gave Eleanor was disappointment. Louis VII was not the king her restless spirit imagined. Raised for the church, he prayed more than he ruled, fasted more than he feasted, and treated his marriage bed as an extension of the altar. Eleanor, raised in the sensual and artistic world of southern France, found herself yoked to a man who seemed more monk than monarch. Chroniclers record her biting words, whispered in the shadows of court. "I thought I had wed a king, but I have found a monk." The court noticed the imbalance. While Louis bent his head to scripture, Eleanor raised hers to command the lords of Aquitaine, who followed her as readily as any knight would follow a banner. She hunted, debated, and ruled with a boldness that unsettled the French clergy. In her presence, troubadours sang of passion and chivalry, while bishops muttered about temptation and pride. To them, she was not merely a duchess, She was a dangerous example of a woman unafraid of her own power. Whispers of impropriety began even in these early years. Some said she was too close to her vassals, too comfortable among poets and knights whose songs carried hidden meanings. Others claimed she disdained her husband so openly that courtiers dared to laugh behind the king's back. Europe had seen queens who ruled, but it had not seen one who ruled with such independence of spirit. When Louis ascended the throne, Eleanor became Queen of France, but Paris felt smaller than Aquitaine. Its rigid court suffocated her. Its religious austerity left her restless. She longed for grandeur and adventure, for a stage that matched her ambition. The opportunity came with the call for crusade. Jerusalem beckoned, and Eleanor insisted on riding alongside her husband, to the horror of many. She did not march as a passive consort, but as a commander in her own right, bringing with her soldiers from Aquitaine. It was on this journey, amid deserts and sieges, that Eleanor's disdain for Louis hardened into contempt, and the scandal that would define her life began to take shape. For she did not simply march behind her husband. She stood apart, radiant, untamed, and already dangerous in the eyes of Christendom. The Second Crusade, meant to unite Christendom under the banner of the cross, had instead revealed how far apart France's royal couple had grown. Louis VII returned from the East humiliated. His armies had failed. His reputation as a leader had withered, and his marriage lay in ruins. Eleanor's defiance in Antioch had become the talk of Europe, and though no chronicler could prove the whispers true, the damage was permanent. Husband and wife no longer walked as one. By 1152, the bond between them was unsalvageable. The papal courts were called upon to rule on their marriage, and the grounds were not scandal whispered by soldiers, but scandal written into law. The Church declared the union invalid on the claim of consanguinity, that Louis and Eleanor were too closely related by blood to have ever been wed. It was a convenient truth, for consanguinity was a flexible weapon, invoked when kings or queens wished to unmake a union. Behind the legal mask, everyone knew the reality. Louis was weary of his bold and restless wife, and Eleanor was already preparing to cast her fate elsewhere. The annulment was a spectacle. For 15 years, she had been Queen of France, crowned, robed, and obeyed. Yet in a single decree, she was unbound. The court gossiped that she walked away unashamed, even relieved. She kept her duchy, her lands, her independence. She lost the crown of France, but she kept the wealth that had made her irresistible from the beginning. For most women of her time, divorce would mean exile, disgrace, or worse. For Eleanor, it was opportunity. The opportunity came swiftly. Only 8 weeks after leaving Louis, Eleanor married again, this time to Henry Plantagenet, the fiery Duke of Normandy, 11 years her junior. To her critics, the haste was proof that their affair had begun long before. To her admirers, it was proof of her cunning. By wedding Henry, she exchanged a pious king for an ambitious warrior, a man already angling to claim the throne of England. The scandal was thunderous. France had watched her ride away from Paris as a discarded queen, and England now welcomed her as its new consort. One court had called her a failure. Another raised her as the future mother of kings. Chroniclers mocked her as reckless. Merchants muttered that she treated crowns like trinkets to be tried on and cast aside. She is not a bride, but a bargain. One voice sneered, echoing across Europe. Yet beneath the mockery lay fear. With Henry, Eleanor now ruled lands that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Scottish border, a dominion so vast it dwarfed the holdings of the French king she had just abandoned. What Louis had lost in love, he had also lost in power, and the woman he could not control had turned into the sharpest weapon of his rival. Thus began the next act of Eleanor's scandalous life, no longer as the queen who failed France, but as the queen who would unsettle England itself. The court she left behind whispered about her shame, but the court she entered braced itself for her influence. She had escaped one crown, only to seize another. Marriage to Henry Plantagenet had transformed Eleanor from a discarded queen into the partner of one of Europe's most ambitious princes. When Henry claimed the English crown in 1154, Eleanor became queen once more. This time not as a shadow beside a hesitant king, but as the consort of a ruler whose energy matched her own. Yet even as she bore him sons and secured the future of the dynasty, Eleanor carved out a world that was entirely hers. In Poitiers, the heart of Aquitaine, she created something that defied the rigid courts of both Paris and London. Her palace became a theater where troubadours sang of longing and betrayal, where poets debated the nature of love, and where knights pledged devotion in terms as lyrical as they were dangerous. Chroniclers would later call it the Court of Love, a place where Eleanor presided not only as a duchess, but as the high arbiter of romance itself. To her supporters, it was a marvel. In an age when women were expected to keep silent, Eleanor turned the language of passion into a form of power. She invited noblewomen to judge contests of poetry, to weigh whether a knight's devotion was true, and to decide which gestures of love were worthy of praise. These gatherings elevated women's voices in a way unheard of in the 12th century. To her admirers, she was a patroness of culture, the mother of chivalry, and a symbol of refinement in a world dominated by brute force. But admiration was never the only response Eleanor inspired. To her critics, the Court of Love was not a sanctuary of art, but a den of corruption. Bishops condemned it as a place where lust was dressed in poetry, where adultery was applauded as gallantry, and where the queen blurred the line between virtue and sin. The songs of the troubadours, filled with secret glances and forbidden desires, seemed less like art and more like open defiance of church and crown. The scandal deepened because of Eleanor herself. She did not merely observe these games of words, she shaped them. Rumors swirled that her judgments reflected her own appetites, that the queen who had once been accused of sharing her uncle's bed was now encouraging an entire generation to clothe adultery in the robes of romance, whether or not she intended it. Her court became synonymous with danger, a place where knights might learn to pledge themselves not to God or king, but to a lady's smile. For Henry, this was both useful and troubling. The cultural brilliance of Eleanor's court enhanced his prestige, but it also gave his queen an independence that unsettled him. She was not a consort content to fade into the background. She ruled Aquitaine with her own hand, and her reputation as the arbiter of love made her influence stretch far beyond politics. In a Europe still struggling to define the boundaries of power, Eleanor blurred them deliberately. Thus, the queen who had already scandalized France and shamed the papal courts became something even more dangerous, the embodiment of a new culture that exalted women, challenged kings, and unsettled the church. For some, she was a muse. For others, she was the serpent still coiled in the heart of Christendom. And as the years passed, what began as poetry would bleed into politics, for the songs of love could not drown out the realities of betrayal. Eleanor's court had given her power, but it had also set the stage for her most perilous act, turning her back on the king she had raised to a throne. For a time, Eleanor and Henry seemed the perfect match. He was restless, fierce, and determined to carve an empire that stretched across half of Europe. She was equally determined. A duchess who had already tasted one crown and knew how to wield another. Together they produced heirs who promised to secure the dynasty. Yet beneath the surface, cracks widened with each passing year. Henry's ambition was boundless, but so was his appetite. At court, whispers grew of his infidelities, and by the 1160s, one name eclipsed all others: Rosamund Clifford, the fair Rosamund, whose beauty was said to have captured the king's heart. To Eleanor, who had endured the humiliation of gossip since Antioch, this betrayal cut deeper than rumor. It was public, brazen, and sharpened by the knowledge that her husband no longer cared if she bore the shame. Chroniclers claimed that Eleanor confronted Henry with a cold fury, that her words lashed him harder than any blade. Yet the queen, who had built a court of poets and knights, could not silence the truth that her own marriage had decayed into spectacle. If once she had mocked Louis of France for being too monkish, now she found herself mocked in turn as the wife whose husband flaunted another woman. But Eleanor was not a woman to suffer quietly. In her, betrayal kindled rebellion. Her sons, impatient for power, saw in their mother both an ally and a shield. In 1163, when the young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey rose against their father, Eleanor's hand was suspected behind the flames. Chroniclers wrote that she encouraged them, whispering that a father who betrayed their mother could not be trusted to honor his sons. The rebellion was swift and dangerous. Across Normandy and Aquitaine, castles flew the banners of discontent, and for a moment, it seemed that Henry might lose not only his wife but his throne. Yet the king was as ruthless in war as he was careless in love. He crushed the revolt, and when Eleanor was captured attempting to flee, his vengeance fell hardest upon her. She was no longer queen beside him, no longer consort in ceremony. She was his prisoner, paraded as the serpent who had dared to turn her children against their father. "I wed a duchess and gained a serpent," Henry is said to have muttered, a phrase that followed her across Europe. Thus the woman who had once ruled Aquitaine in splendor and created a court that reshaped culture now faced her darkest chapter. Her defiance had transformed from poetry into treason, and for it she would pay with years behind stone walls. The rebellion of 1173 ended not with victory for Eleanor's sons, but with chains clasped around their mother's wrists. Henry II, furious at her betrayal, would not let her walk free again. From that year until 1189, Eleanor of Aquitaine lived as a captive, locked behind the walls of English castles while the world moved on without her. Her imprisonment was not a single cell, but a shifting series of fortresses. Salisbury, Winchester, Sarum, and other strongholds became her reluctant homes. At times, she was allowed a measure of comfort. At times, she was kept under harsher guard. But always, she remained a prisoner, watched, silenced, and prevented from wielding the influence that had once made her the most formidable woman in Europe. Chroniclers record little of her words during these long years. For a queen who had once filled courts with laughter and music, silence became her only voice. Yet even in captivity, Eleanor's shadow lingered. In Aquitaine, troubadours still sang of her court of love. In Paris, bishops still whispered of her scandals. And in England, Her sons never forgot that their mother had once stood with them against their father. To Henry, she was the serpent chained. To others, she was the queen waiting for her hour. That hour came with death. In 1189, Henry II, worn down by endless wars and the rebellion of his sons, died. His heir, Richard, known as the Lionheart, ascended the throne. One of his first acts as king was to order the release of his mother, after 16 years behind stone walls. Eleanor stepped once more into the light. But freedom did not return her to obscurity. Richard trusted her as few kings ever trusted a queen. When he departed for the Third Crusade, he named Eleanor regent in his stead. The woman who had once been condemned as a traitor now governed England in her son's absence, proving that even chains had not broken her will. It was a transformation as dramatic as any in medieval history, from prisoner to ruler, from serpent to savior. Eleanor's story defied the judgment Henry had tried to impose upon her. She rode across England and France to secure her son's rule, arranged alliances, and negotiated ransoms when Richard himself was taken captive. The queen who had been silenced became the voice of the crown. Still, those years of captivity left their mark. Chroniclers described her as aged, her beauty faded, her movements slower than before. But the fire of her will remained, tempered rather than extinguished. If Henry had hoped to bury her in stone and silence, history would record the opposite. Her release marked not the end of her influence, but the beginning of her final and perhaps most lasting legacy. And as she neared the twilight of her life, Eleanor, once the scandal of Christendom, prepared to leave a memory that neither kings nor chains could erase. In the final years of her life, Eleanor of Aquitaine defied the passage of time as she had defied kings. She lived on not as a shadow, but as the matriarch of a dynasty that shaped Europe. Well into her 70s, she still rode across mountains to arrange marriages for her children and grandchildren. When Richard Lionheart died without an heir, it was Eleanor who ensured the succession of her younger son, John. She was no longer the radiant queen who dazzled Antioch, nor the fiery duchess who mocked her husbands, but she remained the axis around which thrones turned. By 1204, Eleanor was 82 years old, a near impossibility in an age when few lived past 40. She withdrew to the Abbey of Fontevraud, the quiet stone sanctuary where she had once been imprisoned in spirit, now chosen as her final refuge. There, among cloisters and shadows, she prepared for death not as a penitent sinner, but as a queen who had written her own legend. Her life was a catalogue of scandal. She had been accused of incest with her uncle, abandoned by one king, and branded a serpent by another. She had stood trial in the court of gossip more than once, condemned as dangerous, unruly, even damned. And yet, when she lay down for the last time, she did so as the mother of Richard the Lionheart, the grandmother of emperors, and the woman whose bloodline stretched across Europe. At Fontevraud, her tomb still lies beside those of Henry II and Richard, husband, lover turned enemy, and son, the king of crusaders. In death, they are bound together, a trinity of conflict carved in stone. Visitors see her effigy holding an open book, as if still reading, still judging, still shaping the world she left behind. What was Eleanor of Aquitaine? A sinner who shamed two crowns, or the only queen who bent them to her will? History never agreed. Some remember her as a corrupter, others as a patroness of culture, and still others as the matriarch who forged dynasties. Perhaps she was all of these at once. proof that the women who scandalize the world are often the ones who change it. Her story endures because it unsettles. It forces us to ask whether power in a woman is more dangerous than sin, whether scandal is sometimes the mask that history uses to cover fear. Eleanor lived too boldly for silence, too dangerously for comfort, and too long for her enemies to erase her. And so the abbey that holds her bones also holds her legend, a queen who scandalized Europe and outlived the kings who sought to control her. If you want to uncover more rulers whose scandals outlived their thrones, stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe, so that the shadows of history will continue to rise from the stone and speak again.